Okay. So just going to go over what we've done at previous Wednesday webinars. And then today is going to be about the budgeting option for Excel statements. And then I'll give you an update on the next version. And then most of the time is going to be demo and I hope some Q&A. And you guys are muted. So if you do want to ask a question, just remember to unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can't hear you. So July 1, that was actually a presentation that I had done for users group. So it was crammed full of stuff, and a lot of that we'll cover in these Wednesdays, but in smaller chunks. And then these are the other ones we had so far, and you can find the recordings of all these, if you didn't see them, are on our YouTube channel. So just go into YouTube and search for Excel Statements channel, and you can see those. So today we're going to talk about the budgeting option. So just so you know, this is not included with the base product. It's a $995 option. And I'm not going to be trying to sell you on it. I'm just going to be explaining how to use it. I'm not a sales guy. So it's ideal for doing forecasting. So if anyone out there has used like FRX Forecaster, this can do everything that can do, only you don't have to learn any different interface. FRX Forecaster, you know, they're multi-day training on that. And because you do all your calculations within Excel, with Excel statements, you already know how to do things, you know, to set up formulas to calculate forecasts. And forecasting, I think this year might have been a real lesson for people that it might be a good idea to have a forecast that you can revise and then use that for your management reporting. 2020 has been very much a unique year, and I think it's meant a lot of massive upsets for most businesses out there. So the budgeting option works with both budget and statistical ledgers in Dynamics SL. And just so you know, the budget maintenance screen, which is what a lot of people use, particularly with transaction import, to get their budget information into Dynamics SL, that won't work with statistical ledgers. I'm not sure why, but it won't. And just within Dynamics SL, just so you know, you can make as many ledgers as you need. So you can have original budget, revised budget, you know, Jack's forecast, new forecast, whatever. You don't want to go create those for specific years because Dynamics SL already keeps ledger information by year anyway. So there's no reason to go create a budget 2020 and then a new ledger ID called budget 2021 because the budget, if you just call it budget and then you can go and get it by year. So it's already keeping them by year for you. And there's a ledger maintenance screen in the GL module if you didn't know about that. So the Excel statements budgeting option, it works on a basis model, and we call that guide as well, just to make a pun, and you'll see why. So even if you're not budgeting from a basis, and a basis would be something like this year's actuals as your basis for next year's budget, or your existing budget, you know, original budget as a basis for your revised budget, or the way I like to do it, your revised budget as the basis for your revised budget. And you may not budget that way. You may do zero-based budgeting or forecasting, and that's fine. And Excel statements needs you to tell it kind of a guide for it. So even if you don't need it to guide you, you do need something in there to guide Excel statements as far as where to put the budget balances or statistical ledger balances. So I'm sure you don't understand what I'm talking about now, but I think that'll become clear in the demo as far as what you need in order to guide Excel statements as far as where your budget or statistical ledger numbers go into the database. So the budget entry worksheet with XLstatements budgeting option, it can actually be any format you want, but the only restriction is you have to have PTD BAL cells to the left of the cells that are going to represent your budget or forecast or statistical ledger numbers. So it's kind of a weird requirement, but like I said, we made a pun out of this because those PTD BAL functions are going to guide where the number to the right is going to be placed in the database. The number to the right being your budget or statistical ledger balance. So those have to be there, and that's the only real requirement. So your budget entry sheet can look like anything. It's just you've got to have cells to the left of where you're going to be putting in. You're going to be entering or using formulas to derive your budget, or again, statistical ledger, forecast, whatever you want to call it, those numbers. And those cells, I know sites where they make a column of PTD BAL cells to be used for their budgeting, and then they hide that column. And XLstatements will work with that. So you don't even have to see those guide cells. XLstatements is going to find them even if you hide the column. So the budgeting option can work with sub-account masks. So if you have several segments in your sub-account, let's say you've got region and department, and you don't budget by region, but you budget by department, XLstatements will work with that for you automatically. And it can even generate separate budget entry sheets, in this case by department. And those can be separate sheets on the same workbook, or those can be separate workbooks if you're sending those out to managers with budgetary responsibility. So the budgeting option also retains budget revision history. So if you go and revise a budget, it actually keeps the history for you. And in version 2.5, that's a pivot table report that you can go in and see the revisions. And I know some people out there don't work with pivot tables or are a little terrified by them. And so that will be changing in a future version, probably not version 3. In fact, I know not version 3, but that will be changing from a pivot table. When XLstatements is first installed, it automatically consumes any existing budget or statistical ledger information as your original budget. So it reads, when it's installed, it goes and reads that in to its budget revision history tables. And so that's already there if you've already got budgets in there for a particular year. XLstatements budgeting option lets you put notes in on the revision that you're making. And then you can also put notes on each balance on your worksheet. So each balance that's going to get consumed into your database, you can put notes on those as well. And those notes are visible on the pivot table if you drill down from the pivot table. If you use pivot tables, you can double click on a number in a pivot table, and then it's going to expand out the detail behind that. And the XLstatements budget revision pivot table expands out to show you everything behind that number, and then it also has that note in there just as a wide column. So, excuse me. Statistical ledgers, I know I've mentioned. We're going to have a specific Wednesday tips and tricks on working with statistical ledgers as well. And one thing that some people don't realize is you can keep your statistical information in Dynamics SL and use that to feed forecasts as well. So you might want to forecast sales into a statistical ledger and then use that statistical ledger to come up with your actual financial forecast. Your forecast balances by using the projected sales that you've got in Dynamics SL as a statistical ledger. So like I said, I'm gonna spend a whole tips and tricks, probably 10 to 20 minutes on that in a future Wednesday. Maybe we'll do that next Wednesday if there's enough interest. So there is security with the budgeting option. So you can't press the button to update budget information unless you have delete rights to the budget maintenance screen in Dynamics SL. So even if you didn't turn on modular security or compartmental security, you still have to have those rights in order to press that button. It will only let you update information on budget and statistical ledgers. So none of your actual ledgers, you can't touch those for within Dynamics SL. And then you'll see there's also an option that I think is on by default when you go in to create a budget sheet, that it's going to protect all of your formula cells on that sheet when it turns it into an entry sheet. So version 3, we're now scheduling that for sometime next month. And I'm just going to talk about the budget option enhancements. So one is that if you put notes on a budget balance and then update the budget, in version 3, if you're drilling down from a budget number on your report, that first level drill down, that I call mask expansion, where it'll give you all of the account, sub-account, subtotals, that will now have Excel comments on the balance number for the note that you put in with that budget balance. So that's pretty neat. So if you take a note on a budget balance that you're entering, and let's say it's professional improvement, and you want to put in there a note saying, oh, that's $500 for a seminar for Nancy and $300 for an online course for Steve. You put that note in, and then you have that $800 showing up as your budget on that row of your report. You double click on that 800, and you're going to get the row, the first row telling you, what the ledger is, what the account is, and so forth. And then there's going to be an Excel note or comment. There are different things now with Excel 365. They changed the names of some things in Excel. And you hover over that balance, and it's going to show you those notes that you took. So it's going to say, $500 for Nancy and $200 for Steve. So that's a neat enhancement. You're going to be able to create those separate sheets on more than just sub-accounts or sub-account segments. So if all your companies are in the same database, say, you can tell it, yeah, I want to create a separate budget entry sheet for each company automatically, not have to go do those individually. And then, as I mentioned, version 3.5, that revision history report's no longer going to be a pivot table. And one thing that I know we did some work on is we're going to have a color gradient on that to give you an idea of how long ago any number was revised. And then if there was a note on that balance, that you put in when you consumed your budget entry sheet, then that's going to be in there as an Excel comment. So you're not going to need to drill down or anything. So future sessions, these are just some that we have in mind. You see statistical ledgers is on there. And again, as always, if you guys have any ideas for things you want to see, please let me know. And then we'll move into a demo. So I always like to start with nothing. So I don't think I've come up with a great way to really show how the budgeting works. Once you learn it, it seems pretty simple, but with a lot of people, they budget once a year, and it's not easy enough to be real obvious if you haven't done it for a year. And that's, unfortunately, but it's got enough power that it's not something that's all that easy to get over that first hump to explain. But I'm going to try, and I try something new virtually every time, hoping hoping it's going to get a little better. So you know what I'm doing now. I'm just going to say, okay, this is the budget we're going to do. And this is going to be, this doesn't have to be, you don't have to do it this way at all, but I'm going to use this as my basis. So I'm going to use my actual GL ledger for, and let's see, should we do, let's do a drop down for one segment. So let's say we're going to budget by region. Okay, so I'm going to insert that as a drop down, and we're going to use that for our sub account. And then I'll go and I'll drop the chart in, and then I'm going to remove most of those. Or actually, I'm not even going to do that. Someone pointed out to me that you can't really use Control Z with a lot of what Xlstatements does, because going to get something from the database like that, that's not something that Excel really understands. We're not using any built-in Excel functionality that it could possibly undo. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, okay, let's look at one account. So what was that? 1030. And you guys know why I put that little single quote in. That is saying this is explicitly a text value. And there are lots of ways to do that. I just like to use that single quote. And you notice XLstatements does that as well when it drops something in here. And that just means it's explicitly text. And you know, it could be something other than a number, so it's automatically text, but putting the single quote in front of it is just going to always be text, no matter if it looks to Excel like a date or a number or whatever. So our convention is to put that little tick mark in. And that's a good trick, because very often if you go and say, oh, you know, go change that to text format, must be in here. There we go. If you go and change the format of a cell to text format, then you may be causing Excel to do some stuff that you don't really want. So instead we do that. We put that tick mark in. And if I drop the chart accounts in, which I did, and then I deleted it, that would have put the little tick marks in there as well. And then I'll just do, we're going to put in our account description, Control-Shift-A. What's the account? F4. Okay, so that's the same information if I dropped it in, except I would have had them all. But I thought today I would just work with one. And to start, I know you don't budget one account at a time. Statistical ledgers you might. And I'll cover that in the later session. And let's say this is going to be for period 11. And so that's just where I'm going to put my period for now. And I'm going to do equals PTD val, Control-Shift-A, get my account from over here, F4, and I'm going to get my period from here, F4. And so we can see our actual balance for that period for this account, okay? And so we have a PTD val cell now on our worksheet. So if there's at least one PTD val cell out there, then the budget upload is going to be enabled. And so I told you we call the basis the guide. So theoretically, this could be your basis for coming up with the budget amount for period 11 for this account for whatever sub-account we're working with. But the idea here is when you open the budget upload sheet, it goes and looks at the worksheet you're on. And by the way, this only works with one worksheet at a time. You know, you'd have to go, if you had a lot of tabs out here, you'd have to go to each one to use those for budgeting individually. And so it's going to look at this worksheet and it said, I think for company you're probably using 0060. Looks like you're using the financial ledger, and it looks like you're using fiscal year 1999. So it actually went, and I think it finds the first PTD val on your worksheet and goes and derives that from what's being used in that PTD val. So it's not based on, giving these cells the particular names that they have. It's based on, it actually goes and looks at the PTD val cells. And by default, so our next step is to create a budget entry sheet from this, and that's what this button is for. And by default, when it looked at this, it also said, oh, you don't have any budget entry cells now. So this isn't already a budget entry sheet. So it's by default, it's saying, do you want to insert period columns? And I'm going to turn that off. So you don't need that on at all. It's helpful for kind of a standard budget entry sheet, and we'll certainly do one of those in a few minutes. And then it's also defaulting to protect the sheet, and that's what I was mentioning. If you leave that on, the budget entry sheet that you're going to create will have all of these cells with formulas in them protected, so whoever is filling in the budget can't overwrite those, and you don't want them overwriting those. Now, because I have a drop down for subaccount, it's also giving me an option for creating entry sheets. And this will not be enabled if you don't have a drop down. And in version 2.5, the current version, that's only going to be drop down for subaccount. So if you have a drop down for company but not subaccount, this is not going to be enabled. But in version 3, this will be enabled if you have any usable drop down, and it'll tell you what drop down it's planning to use. And it's going to get that information from the report screen. But I'm not going to cover that. That's future stuff. And this is what I said. You can make those sheets. So in this case, we've got a drop down by, what was it, region? And let's go see how many regions. I'm going to close this. Okay, so we've got 3 regions and then all as well. And I think you know that you can go in here and say, oh, no, we don't need to budget by all. And so turn that off. And now my drop down, all is not going to be in there anymore. And changing the drop down just changes the mask. We're working with the last segment here. So it's changing that mask to the different regions, and those region IDs, it's the 6 one-character segment, and so that's what it's changing on those masks. And you notice when I change this, there is no balance, no actual balance for that particular region. I don't think there's any balance. These being balanced, oh, they're in north. How about that? So when you open this, then create entry sheets. So workbooks means we're going to have it create a separate entry sheet workbook, a separate Excel file for every one of the regions that are in the dropdown. If I said worksheets, then it's going to make a separate worksheet or tab for each one of those regions. So it really depends on whether your managers are responsible for their own budgets and you're going to send those workbooks out to each, or whether you're doing the budgeting, but you're budgeting, in this case, by region, and so you'd have a separate tab for each region. I'm going to turn that off for now. And then insert annual column. This will let you work. It'll create a column for your annual budget, and you can create that manually. I think it has to be named _ annual budget _. I'll put that in the notes. I forgot to go look that up before we did this. But it can also automatically insert one as like one of the first columns on your report. And then what it will do for if you have monthly columns, and we've only got one here for period 11, but if you had columns 1 through 12, and I'm going to show you that in a few minutes, it's going to insert a period column, and then in the budget entry cells, it's automatically going to be dividing that by your number of periods. So it's going to say, oh, look at the annual budget and divide that by 12, and you're going to see those numbers in there automatically. If you started with an annual budget, if you didn't, they're going to be zeros, but the formulas are going to be in there. So they're going to be dividing that new column that it created, that new annual budget column. It's going to be dividing that by 12. And I know that's simplistic. It's just sort of a starting point. If you have, let's say, 13 periods, and the last period is, I don't know, 1 day or something, because you're using that for adjustments, it will recognize that, and it will suggest that you probably want to ignore that last period. That's not the case with this database. This is the Solomon demo database, and so that's disabled. And then we can include inactive accounts as well. Do you want to budget on inactive accounts as well as active accounts? And so then we just tell it, yeah, go create an entry sheet. And what it does is it goes and it looks for, it finds every PTD BAL on this worksheet that is using my guide company, my guide ledger, and my guide fiscal year. Okay, and then when it finds those, it colors the cell to the right, the cyan color, and that's your budget entry cell now. Oh, and also in version 3, it puts a margin around that. I forgot that's another enhancement in version 3. So it went and looked for all of those. It only found one in this case, and so it says, okay, that's going to be where you're going to enter the budget in. And then any number that gets in this cell, and very often that's going to be from a formula that you've got in the cell, you're then going to tell it what the destination is, and you're going to tell it the company. And again, you could have hundreds of these cyan cells, and they're all for the same company, the same ledger, and same fiscal year for your guide. And then you're going to tell it the destination for all of those. And like I said, you're only going to see budget and statistical ledgers listed here. And then you're going to tell it the fiscal year. And if you've already got a budget for that fiscal year, that's going to appear on this little list here. And then I click here, and then what it's going to do is it's going to put whatever number is in there into the budget in Dynamics SL. And you notice we're telling it the company, the ledger, and the fiscal year. Well, it's also going to need the account, the sub-account, and the period. And that's what the cell to the left is giving it. So it looks at the cell to the left, and that's where it knows the account, the sub-account, and the period where this number is going to go, right? And then the company ID, the ledger, and the fiscal year, those are coming from what you tell it over on this side. Okay, so it's simple, but it's powerful as far as how that works. So does anyone not understand what I'm saying? Again, remember to unmute yourself. But that's how, again, that's how it's going to guide that number in here. Like I said, you know, if you want to say, you know, period 11, we'll put that at the top of this column, and you want to hide this one, you know, because you don't want people filling in the budget to see that PTD BAL, you know, for whatever you're using as your basis, that's fine. And you're just going to see these cyan cells, perhaps. But it's going to look to the cell to the left, and you're not going to have a cyan cell unless it has a PTD BAL to its left for the specific guide, company, ledger, and fiscal year that you know, that you're working with as your basis, or that you've put in as your basis, even though you may not be working with it. So I'm going to show you another quick example here. So we've already got those names when they came in. Those are at the by default from insert from SL. We covered this last week. Those are in at the workbook level, and since they were created at the workbook level, those names are visible on any other workbook. And actually, you know, you can go see these are the names that this particular worksheet knows about. And this name over here, this is that table on the structure sheet. So this is that Excel table. This is the name of that table. In this case, for our regions. And if you go here, now it's gonna say, yeah, that's where that table is. And so there's the name of that table is that range, just so you know. That's where that stuff is coming from. So I can go in, let's go in and insert a bunch of, I don't know, let's look, I'll put a bunch of expense accounts in. So actually I'm gonna put all the accounts in, I'm going to delete everything other than a group of expense accounts. Yeah, these are good ones. So maybe let's cut it down a little bit, just so we're working with something that we can all see on the same sheet in here. So I'm going to go delete all these rows. Okay. All right, and then I'm going to put my periods across here. So I'm just going to use the fill handle to stretch that across. And if I put a 1 here and a 2 here, and then I'll show you, and put a 2 here, and then I go and select those two, and then I use my fill handle, you notice it's incrementing by ones because it knows what I want to do. I'm incrementing those by ones as well. By the way, if you drag the fill handle back over something, it erases it. So that's kind of a neat way to erase something as well, fast way. Depends on whether you spend your time on the mouse or the keyboard, I guess. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 1, and I'm going to hold the control key down. And when I hold the control key down, then I'm telling the fill handle, yeah, I want to increment by 1. That's just a built-in trick in Excel. So I'm going to say equals PTT val, Control Shift A, and you know how these are color coded. The named ranges that it's pointing to are not on this sheet, so the color coding is not going to work. It'll work on accounts. So we can see that, that's blue now, and we'll do it on period. F4, F4. Okay, and this being the Solomon demo data, there's only actually data in some accounts for the last 3 periods. So I mean, not a great example here. I mean, this is not particularly real data, but that's what we have to work with. And yes, we were going to have a really nice demo databases being created for us, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So you can go, still you can drill down on these numbers. What's behind that? Where did that come from? Which is nice, if you're budgeting and say, well, I'm using that as my basis, but that looks a little off. You may go in and say, oh, there was a real one-time expense in there. So you probably don't want to have a formula using that. So I'm going to go back into my budget upload. Actually, let's do something fun first. Let's say here we were saying all accounts beginning with 501. So I'll put a question mark in. I could put an asterisk in as well. Difference there, if I use a question mark, it's only going to get 4-digit accounts that start with 501. If I put an asterisk in, if you had some accounts that were 5-digit and started with 501, that's going to pick those up as well. That's just the way wildcards work. And of course now it says I don't have an account named 501 asterisk, so I can't go get you the account description of that. So we'll name it something else. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, yeah, let's make a sheet. And this is off because I turned it off the first time. So it's remembering that. I'm not sure in version 3 if it remembers that or not. And insert period columns is on again because, again, it's going looking for those cyan cells. It doesn't find any. It says, hey, do you want to insert period columns? And I will say, yes, let's do that. And let's make an entry sheet. So it's going and finding all those PTD vals and then coloring the cells cyan. And because I had the insert period columns, it did that for me as well. And you notice it didn't do that with my first row. Okay, you can't budget by all accounts beginning with 501. You have to choose one. So even if you're always going to look at these rolled up, you're going to have to choose one account to throw the budget in. And if you get a result like this and it's like, well, why didn't it color that cell cyan? I need to budget that. That's why we have this little button here. So you can select the cell that's not turning cyan and click here and, oh, wrong one. You want to click the PTT val cell where it didn't turn the cyan cell. It didn't turn the cell to the right cyan. And this is going to say, the account doesn't exist in the destination company, and the account argument contains a wildcard. And this first sentence, what it's also doing when it goes and looks at these PTD vals, depending on the company that you've selected for destination, and you notice the default is the same company, but if I choose a different company in a different database here, and in which case it might have a different chart of accounts, if they're in the same database, they can't. And then I go and say create the sheet. If you've got an account that doesn't exist in that target database, it's not going to color the cell cyan there either. And that's what that's first sentence. So this is telling us two things. The first sentence is there's no account 501 star in the 60 company. And then the more important one in this case is the account argument contains a wildcard. So you can't do that. But if you remember our sub account, we're working with a lot of wildcards in here, and it didn't flag that. And the reason for that is, it allows you to budget by sub-account or sub-account segments. And if you're doing just one segment, you're budgeting by one segment, and your system has two. Like I said, you might have region and department, and you only want to budget by department. It has to be able to work with the fact that there's a wild card over there in the region. And the way that works, the first time you go in to do budget upload, is it's going to ask you what ID you want to use for a wildcarded segment. And I know this sounds kind of obtuse, but actually Dynamics SL budgeting, which nobody uses, it does the same thing. It allows you to budget by specific segments as well. And in that, if you were actually to use that, it will require you to tell it what segment to use. And we have a way here to go. I'm going to show you the screen that you will get the first time that you go into budget and you're using sub-account. And even if you're not using wildcards, it's still going to ask you this. And so in this case, we've got 6 segments in our sub-account, and it's going to ask me, what if you've wildcarded this first segment? If it's just question marks, what budget ID do you want me to use for the budget amounts that we're putting in? And so you just have to tell it which ones to put them in. And like I said, if you're looking at your departmental actuals versus budget, you're going to have a wildcard in there for your region anyway, for the segment that you're wildcarding. And so any ID, it doesn't matter which ID you throw that budget number in, because you're using a wildcard anyway, so it's going to find it. And this is just saying, hey, which one do you want to use? And does it matter? Not really, unless you go in and you're looking at specific, budgets by reporting unit. Even though you didn't budget by that, you can say, hey, there's no budget in there, until you happen to go and look at the specific one that you've told it to use for the default for each of those. And I probably confused the heck out of it, everybody. Do you want me to try explaining that differently, or are you okay with that? And again, the Solomon demo data is crazy complex with 6 segments in here. I mean, this could run General Motors with 6 different entities on different segments in here. But that's what this screen, and you only see this once, you only fill this out once. But if you need to change something on it, then we've got this little trick. For fiscal year, you type mask, and then you right click on update ledger, and that will bring this screen back. And I don't expect you to remember that. And again, this is pretty obscure, and most people see this once. Maybe they call their consultant and say, what is this asking me exactly? You fill it out and it's done. You never see that again. And that's why we had to come up with this way, in case you do need to get that back again. We've got this little, kind of hidden way to get to it. Okay, so now we have all of these cells where we can enter in our budget numbers or forecast or whatever. And I'd say most of the time, you're actually going to have some kind of formula in these. So this is going to be, equals, the actual times 1.02 or something like, probably not something that simple, but, and particularly if you're forecasting, you may have some real complex algorithms you're using for forecasting, and you just want to make sure that the amount you want coming up into your forecast is placed to the left of the PTD val that's going to be for that account, that sub account in that period. So that's the way it works. And so, you fill in all the numbers that you want in here or use formulas for those. And then when you have those done, that's when we go in here and we say, okay, where are we going to send this into? And then I just click this button and it's going to go. And the defaults here, ignore blank budget cells. That's particularly good if you're revising something. So that's basically saying if you don't have anything entered, like the vast majority of all the cyan cells here, it's going to ignore that. It's not even going to look at that when it brings the budget up. And then this other one, remove 0 budget lines. What that does is if you had a budget in there for a particular account, sub-account, period, and you went in and revised that and changed it all to zeros, if this is checked, it's going to remove that from the Dynamics SL database. The Dynamics SL database is kept in a table called account history, ACCT, and it has a row for each fiscal year, ledger, account, sub-account. And so if you make those all zeros for that account, sub-account, fiscal year, all periods zeros, and you leave this checked, it's going to remove that row from the account history table in Dynamics SL. So it just makes things a little sleeker, I guess. And this is where we put notes on this particular budget revision. Did I actually? No, I'm a terrible typist. Sure I got something wrong there. And then we press update ledger, and I think I've only got one. Yeah, I've only got one number in any of the cyan cells. So it's going to bring that one in, for 5020, for what are we doing, north, and for period 5. And it's going to go put that in my 2000 year budget. Now, obviously, you'd have a lot more numbers in here typically, unless you're just revising something. But I click this button, and that's what's going to happen. That's now in Dynamics SL. And I can go and look at my revision report. Not sure which one it's going to. Hey, I think it comes up with the last one you did. So if you've worked with pivot tables, you know how these little filters work here. And so it's basically saying sub-account, and we made it 0 in here. Oh, and look, I had one in there for travel expense as well for revision 1. I must have done that at some other point. And, again, these are all zeros. You can see here there's an actual 0 as opposed to blank, right? I've got this formatted as the accounting. And when I hover over it, we're seeing the details behind that. And if I double click on that, that's going to give me the details. And so these are the notes on the revision. If I had notes on that number, and I'll show you that, then it would give us the notes that we had put on that. I'm going to delete this. So in a pivot table, this is how you have to delete your drill down sheets. In XLstatements, in drill downs, we give you a little button to do that. But I'll go back in and I'll put a note on that. And that's not it. They used to be called cell comments, and now they're called notes. And because in Office 365, what used to be called comments are now called notes, and comments now have to do with a threaded multi-user conversation. So why they didn't name the new thing something different, but instead they named the one that's always been around, they renamed that. It's going to make documentation that much more fun. So, I'll just type something in here, taken to 0. Okay, so now we have a note on that as well. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to go upload that again and update that same ledger. And now when I go to get my budget revisions, this isn't going to automatically update. I have to go back in and say revision report, and that will update this report. Yeah, and so now if I drill down on that, we can see that note over here. Okay, and in version 3.5, that's going to be right on the sheet. It's not going to be a pivot table, as I mentioned, and there'll be a note right on that. And then again in version 3.5, if you had a report with that budget, no, version 3.0, the new version, if you had a report that was pointing to that budget number, in this case 0, and you double click on it, it's going to show you 0, for that account, that sub account, and it's going to have this note visible on that 0 balance amount for you. So that's a nice new enhancement that's coming in a month or two. Okay. So any questions? I knew this was going to be a long one. Completely confused everybody? Anything you don't understand that I did? Okay. So I made this, again, you don't have to use this format, but I made this this is a real, standard format that people would think about for doing budgeting. Do you want me to go and show you how it can create entry sheets? So let's go create a separate worksheet for each. Oh, yeah, I can't do it because my dropdown is on this sheet. Okay, I'll do it for this one. So I would have had to create another dropdown for my sub account in order for me to use that functionality. And actually, that should have been disabled. It will be in version 3. I was looking at it the other day. Okay, so I'm going to say, okay, yeah, let's make a separate entry worksheet for each of those. And it's going to, ask you, okay, what workbook do you want to put this in? This may break because I didn't actually save this. So actually, let me go and save it. Save this particular workbook first. And then I'll go in here and make entry sheets. So test bud, but it puts this bud extension on there for you. And it's saying my default folder is Jonathan documents. And usually your documents will be, and you can change what to use for the default folder in the file options. But I'll say, yep, okay, let's go save it in there. And so now if I go and open my documents folder, we're going to see what it created. Okay, so we can see, so here's one to enter for the default region, and then the north region and the south region for that particular account and period that we're working with. Okay, so that's how that works. And if you've ever used this functionality, it's working off the same engine as that is. So let me go back here. So go into report. This is enabled because it found a dropdown for sub accounts. And in version 3, this you could be working with a dropdown for company or ledger or whatever, and create worksheets, workbooks, print them out, buy those. So this is like in FRX or MR where you tell it, to go create a separate report for each entity at the detail level you're working with. So, okay. Any questions? Any questions on budgeting, or any questions that you have for me on Excel statements in general? No? I put everybody to sleep? Okay. There are no questions. Remember, you may be muted, so this is your last chance to unmute yourself and ask a question. Nope. Okay. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Bye.